So in this video, what I want to basically finalize is the discussion of money in banking and the banking system itself. So one of the topics that we had covered, or at least I'd made mention of on last Thursday, was this idea that banks only hold a small fraction of their deposits. So what we have is what's called a fractional reserve banking system. So a typical bank will typically hold about 10% or so of its deposits. And so what I want to look at here is how actually then the banking system, the fractional reserve banking system, is able to create money. So when we look at what the Fed does, right, we certainly know that the Fed prints money, right? Well, technically the Bureau of Engraving and Printing prints the money, but the Federal Reserve distributes the printed cash. So then what we're going to be seeing here is that banks the fractional reserve banking system, what is done is that the cash is then distributed and then banks make loans. So what this allows us to then do is talk about something known as the money multiplier, which in our case essentially becomes something where we look at the 1 over the required reserve ratio. That's the percentage requirement that banks are required to hold in terms of deposits at their bank. That's set by the Federal Reserve times the change in reserves. So our money multiplier is going to be 1 over the required reserve ratio times the actual amount of cash then that the Fed is actually going to be printing. So, for instance, if banks are required to hold 10% in deposits, then I would have 1 over 0.1 times, and then let's say that the Fed prints $1 million. Then obviously this would be $10 million. Now what is that answer? That answer right there would be the total change in the money supply. So it's found by looking at the money multiplier. 1 over the required reserve ratio times the change in reserves, the amount of cash that the Fed in this case then printed. Total of $10 million would then be the change in the money supply, which graphically, let's see, where should I put that? Let me put this over here. So that the total change in the money supply then of 1 million would serve to increase this by 10 million. Right? The money supply is vertical, and it's going to shift it out by $10 million. As a result, what you see is that the consequence of increasing the money supply by 10 has the effect of lowering R, the interest rate. This $10 million then is coming from two things, right? It's coming from the fact that the Fed contributed $1 million, but then the other part of it is $9 million. $9 million caused by the fact that banks are always lending out 90%. So there's $9 million that's coming from the fractional reserve system, $1 million that the Fed actually printed. Let's look at this loan issue a little bit clearer. So now the book has a nice chart. In my typed up notes I also have kind of an extensive chart. But essentially what we'd be saying is that, sort of in step 1, the Fed prints $1 million. And let's say that they, what they do is they they buy an existing government debt. Right? So to buy that existing piece of government debt, the Fed would have to print $1 million. Right? And let's say they buy it from me. Right? So they're going to buy the existing debt from me. Then the Notre Dame Credit Union, what a great bank. That the Notre Dame Credit Union deposits would go up by 1 million, right? Because I'm going to get that I'm going to get that cash from the Fed, and I'm going to deposit it in my banking account. Now, in step 2, what happens is that the credit union is going to lend 90% of the $1 million because they only have to keep, let's say, a 10% required reserve ratio. I'm just picking that number because it's pretty convenient. So let's say that the Notre Dame Credit Union has a 10% required reserve ratio. Then they're going to lend out $900,000. Let's say they then lend it out to UW Stout. Perfect. Right? Then in step 3, UW Stout banks with US Bank. US Bank, they're going to have reserves that go up by $900,000. And what's US Bank going to do? US Bank is going to lend out 90% of that, which would be, right, $810,000 that would be lent out. And so on and so forth, all the way until it reaches 0. That's why this money multiplier equation, right, let's put this up at the top here. That's how this money multiplier becomes at 1 over the required reserve ratio times the change in reserves. The change in the reserves part, again, always coming from the Federal Reserve, printing its original cash. This rate is also established by the Federal Reserve, but it's the fractional reserve banking system that keeps lending out the money that was originally created by the Federal Reserve that gives you that multiplier effect. Without banks lending out 90% of the money, then what you would see is limitations in the amount of the money supply. And in fact, there would be 2 ways in which it could be limited. Or I guess we could say 2 assumptions that require that money multiplier to be as large as it is. Right? So if the required reserve ratio is equal to 10%, then I would have 1 over 0.1 times the change in reserves. And in some sense, what we have here is a multiplier of 10. Right? Whatever the reserves are changing by, it's multiplying by a ratio of 10. But this assumes 2 things. First, the banks lend out all that they possibly can. Right? Banks are not going to hold any more than what they're absolutely required to hold. And second, that there are what are called no cash leakages, meaning that every time someone borrows the money, they deposit all the money back into the bank, so no one keeps any cash afterwards. As long as these 2 assumptions hold, then that multiplier will be 10. To the extent that these things are not, right, to the extent that banks hold extra reserves, to the extent that banks or that individuals keep some cash, this will be less than 10. Okay, so the final kind of then, when we kind of try to graph this out here, we do two more ways of looking at this. I want to just graph this out a little bit, and then I want to look at the accounting of it as well. Actually, let me break it up at this point, and then I'll continue it on in part 2.